Hi there, everyone. I'm Derek Chollet at GMF, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all for a book talk with Peter Baker and Susan Glasser to talk about their terrific new book, The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III, the former U.S. Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, White House Chief of Staff. I am thrilled to be joined by Peter and Susan because they're good friends. They are two of the finest, I would say the two finest observers of the wall, and they have really given us a great gift with what I think is a terrific book. To me, it's one of the premier biographies of a Washington figure that we've seen recently. Peter and Susan are well known to all of you. Peter Baker, of course, is the White House correspondent, the senior White House correspondent for the New York Times and a political analyst at MSNBC. And Susan Glasser is a staff writer at the New Yorker and a global analyst for CNN. So we have been reading them constantly over the last several years to try to understand what the hell's going on here in Washington. But I really highly recommend you reading their book about James Baker to understand one of the truly historic figures in Washington recently. Peter and Susan, this is not their first book together. They have another book, and just to show you what kind of fan I am, I've got it. I read it at the time 15 years ago, Kremlin Rising, which is a terrific book about what basically the rise of Vladimir Putin and the end of many of our hopes for Russia in the 1990s. It was published about 15 years ago as well. So I'm thrilled to be joined by Peter and Susan. Welcome. Thanks for doing this.
Derek, thank you so much. What a great treat. This is so sweet of you. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, we're delighted. And in fact, you showed Kremlin Rising. Actually, our book party, you may not know this, for Kremlin Rising was true. At GMF. And I still vividly remember exactly right. That because it was 15 years ago and our son was a little baby and we brought him with us to the party.
Yeah. That's great to know. That is great to know. That I was before my time, but I'm glad we could do that. And also, just a truth in advertising, I'm very biased about the book. My first boss in Washington 27 years ago was Secretary Baker. Worked for him for a couple of years, helping him write his memoir. And so from a personal point of view, but also just as someone who follows U.S. foreign policy and politics pretty closely, I can really attest to the brilliance of this book, Peter and Susan. So thanks again. Okay, so we're going to talk amongst ourselves a bit, but I really folks tuning in to ask questions through the Q&A, and I'll weave those into our conversation here. So why don't we start by talking about Secretary Baker's worldview. A bunch of our audience is familiar with him from his time as Secretary of State and the momentous events that he was involved in from 1989 to 1992. I know that he's sort of in that pantheon of great secretaries of state, of course, but he's a different kind of figure than a Kissinger would be. So talk a little bit about, Susan, maybe starting with you, about how what his worldview was, how he saw the world, and perhaps how that took shape.
Jim Baker is an interesting character, as you said, as a Secretary of State. You could write a whole book just about, that 4 years worth of remarkable diplomacy at this, one of the big hinge moments in recent history when it comes to geopolitics and international affairs, right? It was not just that Baker was uncommonly skilled or well prepared, at least in a political sense, to be Secretary of State, but also that his tenure happened to coincide with the events of 1989 to 1992 and the end of the Cold War. Baker was not a stereotypical Cold Warrior. He certainly wasn't, any kind of academic specialist in international affairs a la Kissinger. In fact, I'm quite sure he didn't read Kissinger's books about nuclear deterrence theory. And, probably that's why Kissinger always was a bit suspicious of Jim Baker. The bottom line was he titled his memoir, which you worked on, which you know well, The Politics of Diplomacy. And essentially what he brought to the task was, more than a decade of immersion in Washington and by extension, international politics at the highest level, an innate ability to make deals with people on the other side of the table, whether those were Democrats on Capitol Hill or Edward Shevardnadze. He became Secretary of State. He doesn't speak a single, foreign language in a real sense. He'd never even been to Moscow before, he became the Secretary of State at the end of the Soviet Union. When Peter and I were working on this book together, he was very generous with his time. I remember, initially making the mistake of trying to ask him over and over again, well, what's your framework for thinking about, the Soviet Union? What about Princeton? What did you learn there? He finally was a little frustrated with me, and he said, my main early frame of reference was my beloved tennis coach in Houston, Andrew Jitkov, who was a white Russian. That means his family had fled from the revolution. Look, what's amazing about all that, I say that not to say that he wasn't prepared for this task, but that it's a good reminder, that there's a lot of intangibles that go into being a great Secretary of State. And for my money, looking back on this record, which we'll talk about, Baker had an ability to engage in personal diplomacy and to do things that were hard, and also to see the world. His advisor, Aaron David Miller, said he saw the world as a jigsaw puzzle and, was really better than anybody else at putting the pieces together. His son told us he's the kind of person who, innately seeks to make order out of chaos. And there was a lot of chaos in the undoing of that Soviet empire. So, it really was a remarkable project for us to work on, I'd say.
Right. Well, I want to get into some of the specifics of his achievements in foreign policy. But before we get to that, I kind of want to zoom out and get you to reflect on a comment that you quote early in the book from Tom Donilon, National Security Advisor, Barack Obama, where Tom makes the observation that Baker is the most important unelected official in the United States since World War II. Now, that's a controversial statement that people will say, wait, what about George Marshall? What about Dean? But I want you to talk about that comment and explain the arc of his story and why you quoted it.
Well, I think that, whether we agree with that in the most literal sense or not, I think you can make that case. I mean, as important as Kissinger was, as important as Acheson was, or Marshall, I think that Baker is there when history changes, right? He's not present at the creation, but he's present at the end of creation in that sense. And I think that he managed it in such a way that was, remarkably consequential. But whether he's the first or the third or whatever, part of what makes him the most important unelected official since World War II is that he wasn't just Secretary of State, right? He was Secretary of State when history changed. He also ran 5 presidential campaigns and was White House Chief of Staff twice and Treasury Secretary. And it's those combination of policy and politics that make him unique. Imagine Henry Kissinger and Karl Rove rolled into one, basically, right? Yeah. And I think that if the marriage of those different experiences put him at the center of so many important elements, so many important moments in Washington for a generation. Really, I think from the end of Watergate to the end of the Cold War, it's hard to find something that happened we didn't have his fingerprint on it in some way or another.
Right. I think it's really hard to imagine someone who shares the scope of experience he had, from partisan presidential campaigns to high finance issues to running the White House to international diplomacy. But as you point out in this book, I think it's really an important story to tell. None of that was particularly inevitable. I mean, this is someone who came to Washington in his 40s, and I guess tell us the story of how someone who went from an undersecretary of commerce in 1975 to running the Reagan White House in 1981 to then becoming Secretary of State in 1980.
That's right, Derek. I mean, we talk about Baker in the book as sort of Washington's indispensable man in this period, but the real story is that he is a very accidental indispensable man. And, he didn't even get to that obscure Commerce Department job until he was 45 years old. So it's also the story of a really remarkably successful mid-career switch. And he had spent, his first few decades essentially as an unremarkable corporate lawyer from a family of very distinguished lawyers in Houston, Texas, who were really more than lawyers, essentially city builders, institution builders, a first family. of Houston and the New West. And his father, grandfather, and great grandfather were all not only lawyers in Houston, but essentially building up the family firm, Baker Botts, which became at one point the largest law firm west of the Mississippi. They also, were founding banks. They were running, railroads. They were the founders of the country clubs, the schools that he went to, the neighborhood that he lived in. Was shaped to a remarkable degree by this very remarkable family. He was born literally as the Great Depression began into enormous privilege. He was insulated from its effects. And yet with that sort of family story came an enormous amount of obligation and duty. It was actually a constrained and relatively narrow world in some ways that Baker came from. The family motto after his great grandfather was called Judge Baker, and because he served for 1 year during the Civil War as an elected judge, thrown out for being on the wrong side of the Civil War and in the Confederacy. Very searing effect on the family. Their family motto for generations to come was work hard and stay out of politics. And so one surprise, I think, for Peter and I was realizing how much, in some ways, coming to Washington and politics was an act of rebellion. Baker's father in particular was a very strict, I would say even micromanager of Baker. He nicknamed him the warden with his friends. That tells you a lot, I think, about, what he was dealing with. And interestingly, Baker showed no real signs of this rebellion through much of his first few decades. He did essentially what his family expected him to do. He went to Princeton because his father told him to. He went to the University of Texas Law School because his father told him to. He even pledged an undergraduate fraternity while he was a grown man with a baby and a wife, and had already been in the Marines because his father told him to. And it really is only a couple accidental things that lead him to Washington. His friendship with George Herbert Walker Bush from the tennis courts of the Houston Country Club, where they were not just, kind of cocktail drinking, weekend ball hitters, but they were fierce competitors and won the doubles championship twice. And then the tragedy of his first wife's death, which really, changed everything for Baker's life. So, that's the story of how he gets to the Commerce Department. A series of other lucky accidents follows, but also this is where his talents, which might have simply gone into settling, bank mergers, and railroad disputes, are a series of progressively bigger and bigger stages. Those talents are showcased.
Well, and Susan, you noted the key relationship in his life, professionally, in many ways personally, which was George H.W. Bush. And that's a through line, of course, throughout this book, because it's a through line of his adult life. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, they've been described as brothers, best friends, kind of rivals, whatever. I mean, how do you talk about that relationship and how it evolved over time?
Yeah, look, I think you're right about that. I think this is almost unparalleled in American history to think of a president and a secretary of state who weren't just political allies, but personal friends in a real way long before politics. I can't think of an exact parallel, maybe Jefferson and Madison. To think about cabinet secretaries, I would think maybe JFK and RFK are the only other, president and cabinet secretary who was just so close to the president that it goes beyond politics. And in this case, it was like a sibling relationship. Now, of course, siblings have frictions, and there are moments of rivalry or sourness between them, as there might be between brothers. Obviously, the 1980 campaign, Jim Baker has to force George Bush to wake up and recognize he has lost to Reagan and has to get out in order to preserve his viability as a possible running mate. 1992, didn't want to come back. Baker didn't want to come back to the White House to run that campaign, didn't really give it the kind of energy that the Bush he should have, and therefore when that went down in flames was blamed to some extent by some in the Bush family, and that took a little while to overcome. And there was, the resentment on the part of George H.W. Bush at times that Baker would get the credit for being the shadow president, and he would say to Baker, well, if you're so smart, how come you're not president, right? And there were moments of rebellion by Bush, right? He picks Dan Quayle as his vice presidential choice in 1988 without consulting Baker, almost as if to say, I don't have to do everything that Baker tells me. I don't have to run everything by him. And of course, obviously didn't work out as well as anybody would have wanted it to. So you see those moments of friction. But having said that, they were so close and perceived to be so close that it gave Baker great power, right? He would land in a foreign capital and people would know that the Secretary of State getting off that plane was speaking for the president. There was never any doubt about that. And that's not true. As you know, for so many secretaries of state, you're wondering, well, does that person really have the clout to make what they're saying happen? People wouldn't necessarily think that Mike Pompeo or Rex Tillerson spoke for Donald Trump. And at times they didn't think that John Kerry necessarily spoke for Barack Obama. Sure. So I think that was great power for him. But the relationship then, you know, to the extent that there are moments of friction, where it ends, I think, tells you almost everything you need to know, which is the day Bush dies a couple of years back. It's Jim Baker who goes by his house 3 times that day and is standing by his bedside as he's passing away, literally rubbing his feet of his friend in his final moments of life.
Yeah, no, it's a really touching scene to end the book on, no doubt. Okay, let's talk about Baker's Secretary of State. First, how did he approach the job? I mean, when he walked into the building in January 1989, I think one thing that was very interesting that I had forgotten in this book is how close he became to being National Security Advisor during the Reagan administration, and that he kind of wanted to do foreign policy for a while. So he finally gets his chance in 1989. He was named Secretary of State, I think, the day after the election in 1988. So walks through the C Street entrance into that building. How does he think about running the department, being the nation's chief diplomat? Who does he surround himself with? How does he do the job?
You know, it's a good question, because actually what's interesting, given how much Baker accomplished as Secretary of State, he was not a beloved figure when he walked in the door. And, you know, so first of all, he was given to saying, you know, essentially, I'm not here. I'm not going to be the State Department's representative at the White House. I'm going to be the White House's representative at the State Department. And he brings what he calls, and what others call, his plug-in unit with him. At this point, Baker has already essentially been, you know, running Washington, to use our term, for a long time. And he has, one of the things that's striking about his approach to all these big jobs was he essentially had a small cadre of very talented, very loyal advisors who he brought with him from place to place to place. And that didn't go over super well initially, not surprisingly, with the career Foreign Service and with the diplomats. You know, Baker was seen as relatively isolated in some ways. But one thing that you should know about that plug-in unit was that I think it's one of the keys to Baker's success in all these different roles, is that he was very secure and remains very secure even at the age of 90 in who he is and his abilities, and understanding his strengths and also what aren't his strengths. He's not one of those insecure people who won't hire, you know, top-rate people. These were first-rate people. They were extremely good at what they did. People like, you know, Bob Zellick or Margaret Tutwiler were, you know, also trusted alter egos. So again, you knew that, you know, if they were speaking for Baker, as he was speaking for Bush, that they had his proxy. Dennis Ross played an enormous role. Interestingly, he's in recent years more associated with the Middle East, but actually was a, you know, Sovietologist, and you know, he turned down a job on the National Security Council for the Bush presidency, because he figured that being Baker's policy planning chief and being with him would be where the center of the action was, and I think that turned out to be the case. Baker had actually been close to George Shultz, the Reagan Secretary of State. They were allied in the very vicious internecine warfare of the early Reagan era, but he had a different approach than Shultz. You know, Shultz famously showed up at the State Department with no one there except his assistant, and, you know, essentially said, like, I'm here for you, career people. So he remains beloved to this day, in part for that reason. Baker, you know, was seen as much more political, and he was, and he had this team around him. You know, but his basic approach, which again he had honed in campaigns at the Treasury Department, was the ability to be ruthlessly strategic. You know, he wasn't going to be distracted by even significant but lesser tier events that were occurring, or things where he couldn't make a difference. So, for example, South Africa was undergoing this remarkable change at this moment in time, and you know, the crumbling of the apartheid state and the release of Nelson Mandela. You know, Baker that wasn't his thing. What could he do to influence it? He was very, very focused from day one on understanding that the earth-shattering reforms that were taking place inside the Soviet Union and Gorbachev and this sort of twilight of the Cold War, that was, the main event of his tenure as Secretary of State. And he was very focused on that from day one.
Mm-hmm. Well, getting into some of what he worked on as Secretary of State, I want to go through some of the issues. Actually, though, I want to start with his first big negotiation, which was not with a foreign power, but with the Congress. And I think for some of our viewers who may not remember how bitter the fights were over Latin America, Central America in the 1980s, nevertheless, it was a significant achievement right out of the gate to talk about. And so talk a little bit about Central America, his approach to this, and why he felt it so important to try to deal with the Congress first as one of his first acts as secretary versus a foreign power.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, from the very start, as White House Chief of Staff under Reagan, he was suspicious of the idea of adventurism in Central America. He sits down with Michael Deaver in the first days of the Reagan White House and says, look, your job and mine are going to be to stop these people over there from getting us into a war in Central America. And obviously, he, is only somewhat successful in the Reagan era because obviously Reagan does promote the Contras who were fighting against the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua and so forth. And by the time Baker leaves to go to be Treasury Secretary, Iran-Contra happens after he's left. A lot of people believe, including Nancy Reagan and Michael Deaver, that had Baker been there, or had he been National Security Advisor when, as you mentioned, he tried to become that Iran-Contra wouldn't have happened. He wouldn't have put up with it. But so when he becomes Secretary of State, there's been this decade of debilitating fractious warfare, both in the region between people on the ground and in Washington between Democrats and Republicans over this proxy war, basically. And he decides the first thing he wants to do is get this off the table. He wants Bush to have the chance to be forward-leaning on foreign policy. And if he's simply fighting the fights of the 80s, it will be a waste of time. So literally weeks after an election in which he eviscerates Michael Dukakis as a liberal, criminal-coddling ACLU card-carrying, American, he sits down with Bob Strauss, the former chairman of the DNC, who brings him to dinner with Jim Wright, the Democratic Speaker of the House, and they say, "Let's have a deal on this." And the deal basically,
Texans, right? Three
Texans, right? But two of them Democrats,
right?
And this is the thing. The election is the election. When it's over, you sit down with the other guys and work out a deal. And the deal is basically to make the Contra war go away. If you fund the Contras for a little while longer, we'll agree to an election and we'll abide by, as long as it's fair and free, we'll abide by the results, even if the Sandinistas win. And he brings in Jimmy Carter. He works with Jimmy Carter to verify and certify the results of the election. Now, it actually worked out well. The Sandinistas were lost, as it turned out. Baker didn't think that was going to happen, but he was willing to give away the election if they lost legitimately in order to get it off the table.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so he successfully does that, and it's so much so that the issue kind of goes away. I mean, what had been one of the most highly charged political and foreign policy issues in the 80s is immediately kind of put to the side,
right?
Which is good because, by the end of 1989, there's some pretty historic things going on in the world. Exactly. So I want to take through a few of those and how he approached it. And we'll fast forward a bit to early 1990, post-wall falling in November 89. And German unification, which is, of course, going to be of interest to many of our viewers. Talk a little bit about how Baker approached the issue of what to do with a divided Germany post November 89.
Yeah, it's a great question because actually there was no playbook and there wasn't a plan. And that is, I think, part of what's so remarkable about how quickly Baker made a plan, because actually when he and Bush came in, there's a famous memo from the career professionals at the State Department looking at the question of German unification and essentially telling him, sorry, no way, it's a fantasy, it's not going to happen, no matter how much we'd like it to. And so it's not like, they had this, what became known as the 2+4 framework sitting on a shelf ready to go. Quite the opposite. Interestingly, this happens in November. Then the U.S. foreign policy world gets distracted. Actually, right away, people forget I forgot until we were doing this book, there was the crazy Panama War and Noriega.
It's probably one of the most understudied parts of the George H.W. Bush foreign policy. I mean,
absolutely, absolutely. And again, I don't think this was not Baker's deal. He was pretty strategic, and in some ways, I guess they felt that it was almost a domestic political promise that had been made during the campaign, and that they were pursuing that. So, but of course, Baker, is sitting there, throughout the Christmas holidays, which is when this drama is unfolding. And so, you have against that backdrop, Chancellor Helmut Kohl in Germany by late December making it clear that this unification needs to go on a much faster path than even he and certainly Bush and Baker had anticipated, even in the immediate aftermath of the wall falling in November. So basically, they're like, really rushed on this. The sort of policy planning folks, I mentioned Dennis Ross. There's a young guy named Frank Fukuyama on the staff of the policy planning office at the State Department. Fukuyama's famous End of History article had come out the previous summer. He had actually been in Germany before the wall fell, and he tells the story of being actually at the West German Foreign Ministry and someone telling him basically there's no way in hell the wall is going to fall 1 week before it did. But he and others come up with this idea of what became known as the 2+4, the idea that we would have essentially an architecture for a reunifying Germany that would include the two Germanys, East and West Germany, as the two primary negotiators, and then have this lesser but still significant role of the four victorious World War II powers. Because what people forget in hindsight, this all seems like much more inevitable than it was at the time. Baker had enormous negotiating problems, and that's why it wasn't just a story about Helmut Kohl, doing this, because in fact, the issue of the Allies and their skepticism of this was very real. Margaret Thatcher was violently opposed to German unification. François Mitterrand was very dubious. Of course, the Soviets had enormous pressures on them, and Gorbachev may have wanted to, or understood the reality that he couldn't sustain this military presence in East Germany. But he had plenty of hardliners who within a very short period of time would launch a coup against him. And then there was the West German government itself. Baker, at times, some of his key diplomacy was as a bridge between Chancellor Helmut Kohl and the West German foreign minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who was often not on speaking terms with Kohl. So it really was pretty remarkable. And then actually back in Washington, I didn't realize this, but Baker is often known as Mr. Caution. And that was the phrase that his aide, Margaret Tutwiler, gave him. However, you could argue that this German unification and creating this architecture for a very speedy resolution of it was Baker's moment of boldness as an international diplomat. And when the culminating moment is happening on the sidelines of the negotiations in Canada over the Open Skies Treaty, footnote, that's the treaty that John Bolton just got the Trump administration to pull out of. So there's all this dramatic negotiating going on. And actually back in Washington, Brent Scowcroft and President Bush, who were generally extremely supportive of Baker, were dubious about this. And Baker really got out in front of them. And, he had all these sort of plates spinning in the air. And people were calling back to Washington, including Helmut Kohl. And it became clear that, this wasn't really Bush's plan. It really actually was Baker's plan. Right. But he rammed it through. And from there on in, that approach actually worked. And of course, events also were occurring so quickly. The unraveling of the Warsaw Pact was happening as the backdrop to all of this. So I think that, to me, a lot of people talk about, and I'm sure we will, about Baker's diplomacy in putting together the Persian Gulf War coalition. But for my money, it actually is the kind of frantic plate spinning in the aftermath of of the wall falling that is really probably the pinnacle of Baker's diplomacy.
Well, yeah, I agree, Susan, completely with what you said. I think the Bush-Baker team is often criticized at the time and since for being too cautious and not seizing the moment, not doing enough to capitalize on the dramatic change that was happening. However, German unification, and then the next thing I want to talk about, which is the Gulf War and the coalition building and aftermath, are two examples where they weren't very cautious. Actually, they took a pretty ambitious approach in both those issues, pushing for the unification of Germany, but then also putting together that Gulf War coalition. So talk a little, and an extraordinary confluence of events, of course. German unification's, completed in October 1990. UN Security Council is voting in November of 1990 on the use of force in Iraq, the road constantly. Talk a little bit about that particular plate that is spinning in terms of the Gulf diplomacy.
Well, it's really fascinating because one does follow the next, right? In other words, if the unification of Germany is a signal that the bipolar world is no longer viable, that we're no longer in an East-West Cold War paradigm in which every proxy fight around the world is us against the Soviets, the Iraq situation basically demonstrates that, right? So Baker is in Siberia with Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister, with whom he has built a very strong relationship. They're fishing in Lake Baikal when Saddam Hussein rolls across the border of Kuwait. Now, this happens to surprise both the Americans and the Soviets. Maybe it shouldn't have, but it did. Basically, both sides thought it was kind of nutty. He would never do it. Americans were reassured by our friends in Egypt and elsewhere, the Saudis, saying, no, he won't do it, don't worry. So this suddenly is presenting a whole new challenge to this new world order, just to use Bush's phrase. And Baker does something here, I think, that's really remarkable. And you lead with it in his memoir, right? This is the opening of his memoir, is a scene at Vnukovo Airport in Moscow where he's standing with Shevardnadze, and the two of them together are jointly condemning this brazen rogue act by Saddam Hussein and really laying down a new order, basically saying, this is no longer going to stand. We're not going to put up with this sort of, pirate regime anymore, and let them play us off each other. We're now the policemen of the world together. And so that was the start of the coalition, of course, but then it builds on that. He has put together not just the Soviets and the Americans, but the Syrians are participating. Imagine that today, right? You have obviously the French and German who don't participate in the later Iraq war. Obviously, sorry about that. Ellie,
it's okay. I made sure my dog is downstairs. I pre-positioned to prevent the
we do that. We tried that, but then she gets really upset.
Yeah, I know. I'm with you.
But this coalition is so remarkable that he literally at some point decides, he has to go around the world asking for contributions, financial contributions. And comes up with so many, the Tin Cup Tour, as it's called, comes up with so many that America almost makes a profit on this war, which is rather remarkable.
Amazing. Right.
And so it's a coalition that matters because there's really nobody on the outside of it. It's not an exclusionary thing, and therefore there's a consensus. And that, of course, then constrains actions later because they don't want to go beyond what the coalition is willing to bear. But the difference between that one and 2003 is that there's not, this dissent in the world. There's a unanimity of purpose to say you cannot invade a smaller neighbor and get away with it. We're going to stand together as a united world, in effect, saying that's not possible anymore.
Right. Yeah, just reminding me, Peter, the Vnukovo 2 moment, there was a parlor game that used to be popular, not so much anymore, about like, when did the Cold War end? What was the day the Cold War ended? Was it the fall of the wall? And Baker's, of course, he believed that was the moment,
Exactly.
in his mind, when the Cold War ended.
Well, it's a reasonable interpretation.
Yeah. Okay, so let's fast forward. You mentioned the aftermath of the Gulf War. Baker successfully builds the coalition. Maybe talk a little bit about his ambivalence about the war itself and the use of force and concerns raised during that. But then transition. We talk a little bit about that, and then transition to the post-war, which of course remained controversial for the better part of a decade, up until 2003, 2004, when, as Baker likes to remind people don't ask so much about the decision not to go to Baghdad much anymore. They used to ask all the time, right? So talk a little bit about first his ambivalence about the war, and then the aftermath.
Well, Derek, I think you're absolutely right to spotlight, this is sort of not as commonly understood, but Baker, this was not, I think if Baker had been president, they wouldn't have had necessarily a military effort to force Saddam Hussein out. And certainly he was initially the person who was most pushing not only to make sure there was diplomacy, to make sure that they went to the UN for approval. But even more broadly, I think to question that there would be a military approach, I think he was surprised to a certain extent at how adamant and public Bush was from an early moment on. And in that sense, by the way, you had Colin Powell and Baker having a sort of subterranean alliance of interest. Generally speaking, Baker was a big believer in sticking to your bureaucratic lane, and he didn't want Dick Cheney, then the Secretary of Defense, butting into his lane, and actually got furious when Cheney once went on CNN, questioning Gorbachev's reforms, and escalated it all the way to the White House, and told Brent Scowcroft, dump on Dick with all possible alacrity. So Baker was generally respectful of those boundaries, but he had a pre-existing relationship with Colin Powell, who of course had been in the Reagan White House and was now the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. The two of them did make common cause over their concerns about a military invasion to push Saddam out of Kuwait. But that's a through line for Baker. He's often portrayed, and our book certainly gives you ample evidence to suggest that Baker is at heart a pragmatist rather than an ideologue, that he, wasn't really imposing a fixed vision of the world in many of his roles. And I think that's broadly speaking accurate, but to the extent there is one pretty clear through line in Baker's views about the world, it's that he was by nature, inclination, and ideology, essentially a diplomat and a negotiator rather than someone who believes in a militarized vision of American foreign policy, and a deep running skepticism about what kinds of military actions would be in the national interest. And that's true today, by the way. That's a core belief he has at the age of 90. Mm-hmm. It certainly was true as to why he was opposed, and he was very much opposed to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, both on pragmatic grounds. He thought it would be kind of a disaster, which was, but also I think on ideological grounds. So in the Persian Gulf War, the first round, he didn't have some big knockdown, drag out fight. He understood his friend George Bush very clearly. So I wouldn't want people to come away with a perception that he was, fighting the program or anything. And once it was clear where Bush was going with this, Baker was not only, fully on board with it, but, his subsequent tin cup tour of the Middle East and other parts of the world, rounding up allies for this coalition, is still seen as sort of the gold standard of that kind of diplomacy. And actually, it was the very first war in American history that, almost turned a profit, as we said.
Right. Yeah, and your book reminded me of a really interesting counterfactual, which is when Baker met with Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz in January '91. Had the Iraqis accepted the deal, what would we have done, right? And it's kind of something we'll never know, but that's interesting. Okay, but let's quickly transition to the post-war and the ferocious debate about what the U.S. should or shouldn't do to help the Shia and Kurds in Iraq, and whether or not we should have gone to Baghdad, and just how that played out both at the time, but also in history a bit, over the next 10 to 15 years.
I think people think today that there must have been some big debate, right? But by all accounts, everybody agreed they had to stop, right? So that, Colin Powell said, look, we're just slaughtering them at this point. We've accomplished our goal of liberating Kuwait. And there was nobody who was making the argument that we found anyway, at least at a senior level, of going on to Baghdad. Baker's point was, we have a coalition that I've spent all this time building. We have a UN mandate. All of these things are to liberate Kuwait, not for regime change. And if we go beyond that mandate, we lose the coalition. We're not going to, why would we do that? And they also, and I think Bush saw this very clearly, and he said this basically, he literally articulated the Colin Powell, if you break it, you own it, caution that comes up with his son 12 years later. And he says, if we end up we take out Saddam, we own this place. We have Sunnis, we have Shiites, what are we going to do with it? And he clearly sees the mess that can become. And they wanted a clear post-Vietnam victory. They didn't want something messy. They wanted to be able to say, we've exercised the Vietnam spirit. And the person who went along with all this, by the way, was Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney did not question this. He was in agreement, even though he was Secretary of Defense, and later on, of course, was an advocate of the Second War. And he honestly cops to that. I mean, even in oral histories later on in his own memoir, he never says that they made the wrong choice or he thought otherwise at the time. He doesn't try to rewrite history in that sense. Everybody agreed. But you're right; they made a huge mistake on this terms of the ceasefire, allowing Saddam Hussein to use his helicopters, which became the vehicle for suppression of the uprising by the Shiites, the Kurds, obviously in the north. And you know this because you worked on the memoir. That's the part where clearly Baker is sensitive. And going through these files in Princeton, it was fascinating to see the discussion among him and you guys, the team around him, about what to say about that in the memoir. And he clearly felt sensitive about that. But you're right, that what he says afterwards, of course, is people say, why did you go to Baghdad? As he points out, nobody asks that anymore.
Yeah, it just brought back memories for me because it's hard to think of from the perspective of today, but I remember those, traveling around with Baker in the early 90s after he was out of office. The two issues that he got criticized the most for and was asked about the most was the handling of Bosnia, mishandling in the views of many, and the decision not to go to Baghdad. Everyone would ask him, why didn't you, I don't get it. Why didn't you do it? And as he likes to say, no one really asks about that anymore. So, okay, really quickly, because I want to get to some questions from the audience because we got some great ones in, but talk a little bit about his handling of the Soviet collapse. Because again, another remarkable just transition here, the Gulf War ends, but a few months, in 1991, but then August 91, we have a coup, Soviet Union collapsed. By the end of that year, the Soviet Union is no longer, and he played a central role in sort of thinking about how the US should handle the collapse of this empire.
Well, it's interesting. So, one thing that I think is sort of underappreciated because of how it worked out, there were enormous pressures at the beginning on Baker and Bush when it came to how to interpret what was happening inside the Soviet Union. And those early fights, I think, colored their later views of, what to do when the Soviet Union was actually collapsing. They essentially invested very heavily in Gorbachev. And that was a second guess to a large degree in Washington, and became a progressively harder choice for them to justify. Right? There was a concern, about Yeltsin. Originally at the White House, he was seen as sort of a drunken buffoon. They didn't know how seriously to take him. He was very offended for his part, Yeltsin, not to be received in a more official way. And Baker in particular, because he had invested not only in Gorbachev, but in Edward Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister, they were sort of unlikely duo, but that was probably the key early decision of Baker's, was to go above and beyond building a relationship that had never existed between an American diplomat and a Soviet one. I mean, Andrei Gromyko was the previous Soviet foreign minister, Mr. No. Then Baker invites Shevardnadze to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, which is, outside of Texas, Baker's sort of special place in the world where he has a ranch. And, since he actually was a young boy, has been probably his most favorite place to go. And Shevardnadze goes along with this, and they really bond on a personal level. In fact, it's on a return trip that Shevardnadze hosts Baker, and they're fishing in Lake Baikal in Siberia, the largest freshwater lake in the world, that the information first comes in about Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. And I think that this was a personal relationship that gave Baker unique insight and intelligence around what was actually, how dire the situation was in the Soviet Union. And in some ways, Gorbachev and Shevardnadze are confiding in Baker and also Bush in a way that you've never really seen. They actually had a much better relationship probably with their Soviet counterparts at that time than subsequent leaders have had, certainly than any American president has ever had with Vladimir Putin. Mm-hmm. So this decision was second guessed a lot. And by the time of the Soviet coup in 1991, where the people on the ground at the State Department, I've spoken with diplomats who were, based in the Moscow embassy at that time, they were unhappy with Baker. They felt that he and Bush did not understand the power shift that had been occurring on the ground away from Gorbachev, that Gorbachev mm-hmm. was, losing power and Yeltsin was gaining power every single day. And they saw them as late to kind of switch allegiances to democracy, small d, in Russia and the project of reform. Meanwhile, the hardliners back in Washington, at the Pentagon and elsewhere, like Cheney, they wanted to smash the Soviet Union into a million pieces. And I think this is where you see the tension between Baker and Bush as natural small c conservatives, believers in stability, believers that the world, would just be a more dangerous place, if they couldn't shore up the remains of the Soviet Union, versus ideologues who just wanted to destroy it and to, burn the ground underneath it so that they couldn't return. And that's the tension that you see by the end of the Bush presidency.
Okay, I want to get to a couple questions from the audience. We've got one in from Joel Meyer, who asks that, well, first observes that it seems that Baker emerged in his mid-40s and at the heights of Washington as fully formed as a skilled player at bureaucratic politics. And it's something that's rare and perhaps even unprecedented. And so what gave him the tools to succeed at the highest levels once he emerged from his relative obscurity from Houston? And was it just a coincidence that his natural instincts and skills were well suited to?
Yeah, he look, he learns quickly. One thing, obviously, he does have a natural instinct and natural skill set. It wasn't always smooth. He gets to Washington in 1975 as Undersecretary of Commerce, and he makes some mistakes. He gets into Henry Kissinger's grill by telling an audience, I think it's in Oklahoma, that asks him, a Republican's audience, saying, "Well, is Henry Kissinger going to be there if Ford wins election?" He says, I can't imagine that's going to happen. This is the pre-internet age. I think he thinks it's all going to stay quiet, and what happens in Oklahoma stays in Oklahoma. And sure enough, within a few days, it gets back to Washington, and Dick Cheney, who's the chief of staff in the White House, calls him in and says, "I understand you announced Henry's resignation." Right. And then Kissinger, he ends up having to call Kissinger and kiss his butt to make up to it. So right. I think he learns early on, basically, a number of lessons like that. Like, first of all, understand where power is. Understand how to, that you're always on the record on some level, even if you're off the record. Be careful what you say. He understands from the 76 convention not to lie to reporters. I know that sounds basic, but it really is not in Washington these days. He understands that when he gave accurate delegate counts versus the Reagan people who were puffing up theirs, that it gave him credibility, and the credibility power, and that meant a difference. So he learns things like that. In the Reagan White House, he learns that, Congress is all important. You have to talk to Congress. He never let the day end without returning every call he got that day from a member of Congress. Now, sometimes he returned it at 9 o'clock at night when he knew they weren't going to be there, but he always returned the call so they would feel like they were being listened to by the White House. Things like that. He had an understanding of what really mattered. He negotiates a power sharing agreement with Ed Meese and says he understood what it meant something to Meese. He says, okay, you have cabinet rank. I won't have cabinet rank. You'll have cabinet rank, which Meese really valued. But Baker understood pretty instinctively that cabinet rank means nothing in Washington. He kept for himself personnel, paperwork, right? The staff secretary gets you the paperwork to the Oval Office, press and legislative affairs. Those are the real tools of power in any White House. And Baker instinctively understood that. So he had, I think, a grasp of what matters and what not, how to make the machinery work in a way that served his interests. And it's partly because he was a lawyer, maybe. Is it partly because he just was cannier than the average cat, I think.
Yeah, and I think also, building on a point Susan made, the fact he was confident enough in his own skills, but also understanding his own shortcomings, that he surrounded himself with people like in those early days, Dick Darman, who sat on all the paper, really helped him get his bureaucratic skills up and running. Actually, speaking of the way he managed Congress, but I'm also brings to mind the way he handled the press. He famously always enjoyed pretty good press. And the two of you have spent your careers working with Washington officials as sources, as folks you need to talk to for your jobs. And now that you sort of side, from his perspective and how he looked at the press, what struck you in terms of the way he worked with the press?
Well, look, first of all, it was a different media era. And, he, especially, I think it was really in the Reagan White House that he sort of came into his own as a, foremost wrangler, and manager of both his image and that of the White House, you could control a narrative at that time in a way that is, hard to imagine now in our sort of fragmented moment. But, there were 3 networks, there were, Time and Newsweek, and there were, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. And so you had the ability to put out a concerted narrative. He was particularly famous for his end of the week backgrounder briefings with the news magazines, in which they thrived on a sort of like you were there inside the room journalism and a sort of reconstructions of these big events in the Reagan presidency. And, often they featured, not surprisingly, Baker, the source, at the center of whatever fight of the week they were portraying and getting inside. And so, that worked for him. I do think the credibility that he built up and that he continued, he was an aggressive spinner. But to this day, both people who covered the Reagan White House and also people who covered him as Secretary of State, they held him in extremely high regard because he knew what they wanted. So he'd learned, from these news magazines that a telling detail, a colorful, but ultimately maybe inconsequential, a bit of, inside the room, I was there scenery combined with, giving them the straight shot. If he didn't think he was gonna, when he was flying around the world on his shuttle diplomacy to make Middle East peace happen, he was not, if he thought that a meeting didn't go well, or that they weren't there yet, he was going to tell Tom Friedman of the New York Times, who was on the plane, and David Hoffman of the Washington Post, who was on the plane. He wasn't going to lie and say like, well, this is it. This is the big one. He was going to say, well, guys, we're not going home yet, and he also, I think I would add to the mix of what Peter said as far as his innate skills, certainly ferocious discipline, competitiveness, that tennis court, he was a winner. He needed to figure out how to win at everything. And that included managing the press, but also a certain emotional intelligence that you can't teach, and an ability to be a shapeshifter. He's a native son of Texas, and also, an Ivy Leaguer onto multiple generations. And that worked for him on Capitol Hill, where, one of his advisors, still marveled over his ability to literally talk duck hunting with Jesse Helms and go next door and talk about opera with Chris Dodd, and not to be lying to either of them. And so, of course, that's very useful in diplomacy. It's also useful in engaging journalists where they lived. And he has a natural curiosity. He likes gossip. Journalists love gossip. He understood them as sources. He's not sentimental. So I don't think he did it out of love of these people. Like Richard Holbrook, whom you also knew well. Richard Holbrook, to me, he was like a journalist manqué. I mean, Holbrook actually kind of was a journalist in the form of a diplomat.
He was a frustrated journalist, right? He wanted to be a New York Times reporter. So
absolutely. Right. I mean, his eyes lit up, and he really wanted to know, journalism gossip.
Baker did not.
No. He didn't give a shit. He understood that journalists could be good sources for him, and also that they would portray him in the way he wanted to be portrayed.
Exactly. And he also loved a good joke. Often pretty earthy jokes, right? So,
That's right.
We've got under 5 minutes left, and so I want to do a bit of a speed round with you guys. So, what's your favorite Bakerism?
Favorite Bakerism.
There's a few. Yeah, go ahead.
The one you hear the most, of course, is the 5 Ps, right? Prior preparation prevents poor performance, which we've said a million times.
Yeah,
it's a little too earnest. I mean, he had a lot of very elaborate hunting, anecdotes that like are untranslatable certainly into Russian, like that.
There's a Gamal, his translator at the State Department. Who translated some of his conversation with Hafez al-Assad. Say it was really hard to kind of translate from Texan to Arabic. He says it was hard enough to translate from Texan to English. Things like what was the
There's dog ones. The dog ones are always the
Dog won't hunt is obviously a
Yeah.
familiar one, but there's something about it. I forgot now, the frog and the belly and the scratching of the, I don't know, I've forgotten all these things.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, for me, it's dead cat. We're going to leave the dead cat on the doorstep. That's
Yes,
always a good
exactly.
one.
That's a very good one. Right.
That's on the Middle East peace process.
For those
That's
who don't
the
understand-
Middle East peace one. Yeah.
Right. For those who don't understand what he would threaten the Middle East leader. It says, you're going to be the person with the dead cat on your doorstep, meaning you're the one who will be blamed if this doesn't go forward.
Right. And then you, I think, very bravely lead a chapter title with the rat F-bomb, which I had not heard before. That's a good one.
Yeah. That was by his time in the Reagan White House, Yeah.
Which is
okay. Favorite, this book reflects a ton of research. I mean, you spent hours and hours and hours with Baker and his family and former aides, but also you combed the archives, multiple archives. So what's the favorite document you unearthed?
Well, that's a good question, actually. And we should thank you because even having gone through all these documents and archives for so long, Derek, the audience should know, found things himself that he then pointed out to us that were super helpful. Really great of you to do that. And it does show that there's so much out there. I love the stuff actually about the memoir, honestly. I loved in some ways, he probably doesn't, but I love the fights over what to put in it because I thought that was just really telling about, he is a politician, of course, at heart, and his memoir, as any memoir of a politician is a political document. And what he chooses to emphasize and not emphasize, I thought were really interesting. What else? I think there were some great love letters to his first wife.
There was that. I actually love the memos, prepared for some of the campaigns that were just like brutal. Like, Jerry Ford, there's this one document about like Ford going around everywhere he went. I'm thinking about this in the context of the current campaign. Actually, he was losing votes.
Yeah, they would poll every time he went to Wisconsin. They would poll, and after he left, he would go down.
Yeah, I mean, there was a document, a memo prepared for the Bush campaign, that showed like how terrible, Bush was seen as, and all of his liabilities, the ruthlessness with which they wrote down on paper, and showing that behind the bullshit theatrics of politics that these people were, kind of like ruthlessly. Clear.
Another good one. We found a note in this file that he wrote to Mikhail Gorbachev denying that he was a leaker.
Yeah.
Because Gorbachev was mad about something he had seen in the paper, and Baker's writing, I wasn't the one who leaked that.
Well, and by the way, here's another kind of salacious one. The name Jennifer Fitzgerald will be familiar to some people on this call. She was a very close advisor, shall we say, to George H.W. Bush. And Baker was infuriated by her in the 1980 campaign. She was Bush's gatekeeper, and he felt that even though he was running the campaign, and there are all these notes to himself, he's making all these like lists about like, how infuriated he is about her. He's not sending them to anyone, but the fact that he kept them.
Yeah. Well, I think the most extraordinary thing I had seen, which you talk about in the book, and I know you'd seen, was the letter to George H.W. Bush in 1970 about Mary Stuart, his first wife.
Very poignant. The one person he tells in the world when Mary Stuart gets a terminal diagnosis is George Bush. He doesn't even tell his wife. His wife knows she's sick, but he tries to keep from her the idea that she's going to die, so her last months are as pleasant as they can be. He doesn't tell his kids. The one person he tells is George Bush. Going back to what we said earlier, that's a friendship that is beyond politics, right? And then she writes a letter to him because, of course, she knew she was dying. She writes a letter to him that she leaves for him to find after she's dead. And he reads this. When he gives this to us, he reads this, and he's even at age 80, whatever he was at the time. It's still enough to bring him to tears, and it's a very heartbreaking letter.
Absolutely, it's amazing. Okay, we're over time, so I've got one last going out question for you, which is, what does this story say about the way Washington has changed or not?
Look, some things about Washington or any capital city are eternal. You could read the story of Jim Baker as a handbook for how to like destroy your bureaucratic rivals. And most of that, applies today and eternally. But in the end, this is a story about a particular moment in history. It is the story of Washington from the end of Watergate to the end of the Cold War, and a world in which the political incentives to do things and to govern from the center and to make deals across the aisle, existed in a way that they simply have evaporated in recent years. Our politics is what has changed so fundamentally from that time. And it's not to say that there aren't urgent national interests now, or even many things that you could conceivably come up with a bipartisan consensus on. But politicians don't perceive their incentives. They don't see that the road to re-election runs through those deals in a way that Baker very clearly perceived. That success in winning was about governing in some way that it is not right now. And of course, I think that is the kind of tragedy of studying this story. The political part of it is a different story and kind of grimmer, right? You can paint the line from Reaganism to the rise of the Gingrich Republicans and the 1988 brutal campaign and the 2000 recount and this kind of winning is everything hardball politics. Baker was absolutely part of one of the architects of that new style of Republican campaigning. But I think on the governing side, the story is very different, and it suggests a man who not only believed it was his responsibility to work with Democrats and to come up with national deals, but actually was uniquely good at doing that as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Susan, that's a terrific point to end on. I really want to thank you for taking the time. It's been a really, really fun hour for me. So thanks so much for doing this. Thanks so much for writing this book. It is, again, it's a trade. Please go to your local bookseller and get a copy. Unfortunately, in normal times, we would all line up and get our book signed. Right now, we can't do that. But we'll look forward to doing that someday. This is, again, it's a great story about an important public figure and some historic times, written by two of the most wise watchers of Washington. So thanks again for doing it. Thanks for being here.
Derek, thank you so much. This is a lot of fun. Really great.
Absolutely fantastic. And by the way, if you send us an email, we'll send you signed nameplate.
Oh, that's great. Okay. All right. Terrific.
We're happy to do that. And we've been doing that a lot. So anybody who wants that, please.
All right. Well, I'll be doing it later this morning. Excellent. Thank you. Okay,
Absolutely.
guys. Thanks everybody for watching. I appreciate it. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys. Have a great day.